path for us to be able to actually do some storage in our groundwaters? Do you think a significant amount? I mean, substantial enough?
Yeah, we got to figure that out. I'm not sure how quickly that water's going to go down the hole.
Okay.
All indications are it's about half of the speed in which it comes out of the ground. So, but we'll see. We may have, based on our water quality and the chemistry, we may not be as productive putting water down the hole as this.
So he's Wells Fargo Bank.
So we'll have to see.
Yeah. Jeffrey, could you mute your microphone? Okay, thank you. Okay, good.
We're trying to do some cross training.
Good morning.
Morning. All right, you can turn your camera off and mic off. I think we're about ready to begin. Hey, Tiffany. Can't hear you yet. Hi, Kristen. Good morning.
Morning. Birthday, Dave.
Thank you. See the cards over my shoulder.
Oh, look at that.
Oh,
I just wanted to check on my everyone.
Yeah, really sound good. All right, let's begin.
Ready to start the broadcast?
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to our meeting of the Water Commission. So I want to call this meeting to order. And I would like to ask the Commission Secretary to conduct a roll call.
Okay. Liaison Sneddon? Here. Commissioner Young?
He's here.
Commissioner Young?
He's on mute.
Here we
The
go.
microphone.
Am I muted?
Commissioner
You're on.
Davis?
Now you're like, okay. You go ahead and say yes.
Commissioner Davis?
Here.
And Vice
And-
Chair Kilborn? And Chair Keller?
Here.
Did you pick up my here? Okay.
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Hagmark, are there any changes to the agenda?
Chair Keller, there are no changes to the agenda today.
Okay, thank you very much. So I open it up now for public comment on items that are not on the agenda. Commission Secretary, do we have any hands raised or any items that have been brought to the for the public comment?
Chair Keller, I don't see any public comment at this time.
Thank you very much. So I would like to, well, the only consent item is the meeting minutes. So are there any questions or comments?
Move approval.
I'll second it.
Okay, so can we do the roll call, please?
Yes, this is a roll call to move the consent calendar. Commissioner Young?
Yes.
Commissioner Davis?
Yes.
Vice Chair Kilborn? And Chair Keller?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to be moving on to our two administrative items. The first one is the Water Resources COVID-19 response update. So Mr. Hagmark, can you please give us your update?
Chair Keller, commissioners, we've had this agenda item on here. I don't have a lot of new updates on this, but of course, I want to just take the opportunity to open this up should the commission or public have any comments, but I'll go through. I have a few slides here I'd like to just go through. Next slide. So as I'd mentioned, no significant changes. Our city drinking water remains safe and reliable. Wastewater continues to be treated and safely released back into the environment. We do have plans in place should the pandemic impact our staff and how we would adjust and prioritize our workload. City staff are available and responding to emergency requests for work, including main breaks and sewer main repairs. And at this time, all capital projects in construction are currently back to work. And that includes the water main replacement project, which restarted on June 29th. Next slide. Did want to give a little update on the wastewater testing. This was a hot topic last time we met. And to help me on this one, I have Ms. Amanda Flossie, our wastewater system manager, and I believe Galen Fair, our laboratory supervisor on.
Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Hello, commissioners. My name is Amanda Flossie. I am the wastewater systems manager. And we have been since March 24th consistently testing our wastewater for COVID-19. Over that time, we have been utilizing BioBot laboratories. And over to the right-hand side, you can see that BioBot's results, how we were trending. And I do call this just trending. This is trending analysis. This is not scientific because BioBot is a research laboratory, not a regulatory laboratory. So I would really caution with these numbers because what we have found that there is no QAQC system with BioBot. And so we have been researching other laboratories for not only reduced amount of cost for tests, but also to obtain the QAQC system and to find a lab that is in regulation, such as our lab. We have found 2 laboratories. One is Source Molecular that we have been sending our samples since the 15th. And we continue to send samples. Another we just found and we will start testing, I believe, on Monday. We just got our test kits this week, so we will start testing with them and compare them to Source Molecular and those test results. We found that those 2 labs have the same QAQC system and seem to have the same process of analyzing our samples. And so our cases and our estimates and the results we've gotten from BioBot are not really consistent. And the reason is we don't know what BioBot is using. Every time we ask, they tell us it's proprietary information. So they just give us the results and we don't really know and really can't tell what it is how they're testing our COVID. And another problem that we have with BioBot is their inconsistency with their results. Every sample or every results we've gotten, they've actually taken back and found an error and resubmitted it to us. So as you could tell on 6/8, that number is sufficiently out of whack. And I think that's an industry term. It just does not correspond to anything. And we asked them about it and they could not go back to our sample and relook at that. So it's another reason why we are looking at other laboratories that have the QAQC system, because quite frankly, I'm just not confident in sharing this information with the public. I do not stand behind it because I cannot answer questions because I just don't know, and I don't know the regulations that they are testing under. Therefore, I just kind of, luckily our laboratory supervisor has done a lot of research and has found other other laboratories to get us the testing results, because we do recognize this is important and it's really important information to have for our community. And so we would like to share it, and I would only be confident in sharing this information if there is QAQC systems and we can stand behind it and answer the questions that may arise from it. Anything else? I have Ms. Fair here to answer any kind of technical or laboratory questions that we have for it.
Wow.
Thank you very much. I think this is, it makes sense. Looking at the BioBot results again, they didn't make a lot of sense before. And I think it's better to keep them like this. Okay, any questions from somebody else? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for finding this additional source. I think it's going to be a much better option.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Fair, for all of her diligence and research.
Well,
on
it was
this.
not
I
luck,
appreciate
it was hard work.
It was a lot of hard work, and it continues to be. And she's been talking to a lot of local and national kind of labs to find what everybody else is looking for as well.
Got a question if I could, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Yes,
Go for
please.
On this topic, is there any value to the data? Or is it all suspect?
Commissioner Young, the value I see, what I see is the trending, the trending of how we do as a community. That's what I see as the value to our community right now. Obviously, the more testing, the more data that we have, and the more information that other research communities and the CDC comes up with, I think we will find value, maybe a little bit more that we don't even know. And I do want to say we still are working with UCSB, who is taking weekly samples for their own research project. And so they will probably find even more value once they continue their research. As a community, this is just trending. And I actually, where I see the real value is when we start seeing non-detects like we did on the 11th and 18th, and showing how those closures did really work. And when we start seeing non-detects and we continue to test and we start seeing detection. When we start seeing detection, then we can act accordingly, or maybe share this with the health that we see this in our system and it may become an issue.
So the June 8th data, that data point, I guess the 700,000
Yes.
data point. So that could be suspect, right? I mean, that's very, very high. But then look at June 15 and July 7. That certainly suggests an upward trend in the amount of COVID in our wastewater stream.
Right.
Correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so those actually, the 8th, I would just throw out. It really does not correlate to anything. And what the 15th and the 7th shows us is it kind of stands behind all of our testing that the CDC is doing, or our health department's doing, and all those positive tests, and how I believe it supports that data that is also those positive tests and where we're going as a community. And if we get more of that data, it can also show if there are spikes or if there are valleys, or if we are just plateauing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. In my opinion, I think the data will give us early indications, either we're doing better or we're doing worse. And so if we have another spike, well, when we're in the high end, it doesn't really make a lot of difference. But once we're going down or when we're going up, I think it'll be an early indication of those. And I think that's helpful. But yeah.
I think where this technology could really, I think, make some huge leaps is in the turnaround. I mean, right now, as you can see, this data is 2 weeks old. And so I think that's kind of right now for this virus. I don't know that that's all that helpful. I know Ms. Flossie has reached out to the medical industry or the community, and they're really not looking at this data because I think they have better tools that are giving them more of an indication of what's going on right now. But you know, I don't know if Ms. Fair has any. Do we think the turnaround could get quicker? Is it something in like we could get a 2-day turnaround at some point when they get their routines down, and it actually could be meaningful to us?
Yeah, Mr. Hag.
I agree with, and I think Ms. Fair would also agree with me. If they get their lab testing done and it starts coming out in a 2-day turnaround, then I do believe it will be super helpful, because what has been explained to me, and Ms. Fair probably can explain a little bit better, it shows up in our bodies, in our system, in our fecal. We start shedding it before we even have any kind of, if you get tested positive, it's before that. I believe we have a 5-day indicator before you would test positive. If you had it, your body would begin shedding it. So we would get a whole week before you even get a positive test if you were to take the test. And so it would provide us even more of an indicator later on down the line if they were to get us results back, say, in 2 days rather than 2 weeks. But because the results do come back in 2 weeks, it's not as helpful to the community to make decisions.
Yeah, Ms. Flossie is right. One of the challenges that, and all of the labs are very aware that the data is sensitive and they're trying to get it turned around as quickly as possible, but the influx of samples that they're all receiving, I think everybody's has overestimated their ability to turn it around. And that includes some of the newer labs that I've found as well. And one thing to note that out of all of this research so far, what they're finding is that those that are infected shed a large number of viruses in those first 2 to 3 days, and then they will reduce the amount of virus that they're shedding throughout the rest of the illness. So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at the data. There could be spikes due to, you know, a number of people being infected, and we might think it's a lot higher infection rate when it's actually just maybe a handful of folks. So those are some of the things that we have to be aware of as we're looking at this data. But if we did get it in a much quicker turnaround time, we could predict what the health officials are saying. We could predict that before they see it. So it's a challenge, and all of the labs that are trying to get into this game are well aware of that. But I think everybody's still struggling with meeting that real short turnaround time just based on the number of samples they're receiving and the process, the method that they're using to test. So there are some shorter tests that are coming out that are more of an estimation. Curious to see what those look like and how the results come out on those. So it's going to be continued. It's a continued research project at this point. So any data that we get, we just really need to use as a trending tool as opposed to concrete evidence of who's infected.
A question I have is, could you explain again what the catchment population method is?
Commissioner Young, I apologize. I threw that in there, and after the fact, I realized I should have just put population. So what that is the amount of sewage that is in that population. So it's almost like a sewer shed. If you can equate it to a watershed, it's a sewer shed. So for the testing that we're doing, our catchment population is about 80% of the wastewater flows. Figure it's 80% of our population in the city of Santa Barbara.
Okay. Are the samples done by grab samples?
They are composite samples.
Over what period of time?
24-hour.
Okay, so is it like hourly? The sample is taken and then it's averaged?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And the bottom point here the SARS-CoV-2 data is best used for trending. That's what this data is. This is SARS-CoV-2 data.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So COVID-19 is the illness, and SARS-CoV-2 is the virus that causes the illness.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, next slide. So on this one, I just wanted to touch on what right now our public messaging looks like. We are this month putting out information about our smart irrigation because this is a big month for outdoor water usage. The CNIB is the city's news in brief, which is a newsletter that goes out. And then we're also using Nextdoor to get information out to our customers. We'll also be hitting on wipes, clogged pipes, bill payment assistance, and building flushing. And we've got some dates aside for that. And with that, I think that's our last slide. We're here to help. And so if there's any questions, there's some good contact information on here. And with that, I turn it back over to you, Mr. Keller.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from commissioners or from anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much. So moving on to the second item. The second item is an
Commissioner
update on
Keller?
the... Yes.
There is a hand up for public comment on this item.
Okay, thank you. Mhm.
We have one attendee that would like to make a public comment, Ms. Hillary Hosser. Hillary, I will unmute you and you have 2 minutes to speak. Hillary, please unmute yourself.
Sorry, guys.
That's okay. We can hear you.
It's like she muted herself again.
Uh-oh.
There we go.
I'm muted now.
Yep.
There we go.
I'm now. Hey, sorry, I should know this by now. Sorry.
No problem.
I got on a little late and just got the tail end of this and appreciate the discussion on this and how it's going. I cannot, the two things. I can't, even though it's 2 weeks old, that we're looking at, the one thing I think everybody can agree on is that you see the results of what happens by certain events. Like we just had another big shutdown right now, and we're gonna see soon enough how that works in the community in terms of cutting down virus. I think even at 2 weeks, that is valuable information. Joshua, you mentioned something about better tools out there. I would love to know what they are. And I think this is a So that basically, I'd love to know what the better tools are if they're out there. And just to make the point that even at 2 weeks old, we would be getting valuable information on actions taken topsides. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the comment. Mr. Gagmer, do you want to reply to that? I think we covered that, but if you want to reply to that.
Yeah, all I was, I think, referring to is that we really do need to see some improvements in the turnaround and technology there to make it, I think, a more valuable tool to our community. But I guess the best way to help support that industry is to continue to move forward with the current testing. And we'll continue to try and find affordable ways to do that. So it's not a huge burden to our ratepayers, but hopefully that investment will ultimately drive innovation and technology that will get us, I think, to that point where we get the turnaround of, a day or two, and then we can actually, I think, really have some meaningful input that we could give to the medical profession.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think, with the cost down from 1,800 to 300, that's going to make a big difference, and also much better QAQC that will be very useful. Now it's just a question of time. So the second item is an update on the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, and we have plenty of time for it. And so we're going to have a very good presentation, but feel free. I think there's a number of questions. And so if you at any point want to sort of have a conversation, discussion, clarification, let's do that. So Ms. Corey, please go ahead.
Good morning, Chair Keller and Water Commissioners. I'm excited to provide you an update on our long-term water supply planning effort, which we are referring to as the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. Since we were here with an update on this item in April, there's been a lot of work completed, and I'm really excited to share some of those results with you today. We do have a very detailed presentation, and we're going to be focusing on three main topics. We'll look at our stakeholder engagement process and the feedback that we've been getting from our Water Vision Santa Barbara stakeholders. We'll also be looking at our future demand projections and the work that's been done around that, as well as an analysis of our current water supply portfolio. We hope to get feedback from you at several different points along the way in this presentation, and we've built in some pauses for discussion. So I'm looking forward to that aspect of the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over now to Jeff Seitel. He's the president and CEO of Water Systems Consulting. He is going to give an overview of the project, and then we'll go ahead and dive into the results. So Jeff, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Dakota. Good morning, commissioners, city staff, members of the public. Glad to be here with you all. I'll start by giving a little bit of an overview of the project, Water Vision Santa Barbara. So next slide, please. So the purpose of Water Vision Santa Barbara is to provide long-term water security for Santa Barbara by preparing a water supply plan that is equitable, fiscally and environmentally responsible, adaptable to future conditions, and builds on the city's legacy of effective water management. So really what that means is that by June 2021, we will develop Jeff, yes.
Real quick, sorry, do you have a headset? There's kind of like a feedback. I don't know if do you have anything close by?
Let me see what I can do here.
Seems kind of an echo.
Give me 1 second to change my audio source.
Let's see if that helps.
Okay, is that any better?
Still sounds kind of the same.
1 second.
No audio now. Still no audio.
How about audio now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is there still feedback?
It sounds a little better. Yeah.
A little better. Let's try it. And if it doesn't sound good, I can make another adjustment. Okay, so the idea with Water Vision Santa Barbara is by June of 2021 to develop an enhanced urban water management plan that reflects the city's values and presents a long-term water supply plan for the city. And the Water Vision Santa Barbara process includes a very robust and inclusive stakeholder engagement process that we'll talk a bit more about here in this presentation. And our intent is to create a plan that is equitable, resilient, and environmentally responsible. Next slide. So this shows a schedule of the overall project, and you can see that orange triangle. We are here. We're at the second Water Commission meeting that is scheduled for the duration of the project. We'll be seeing you again in October and in January. We wrapped up our objectives and planning basis portion of the project and the demand analysis. and are nearing the end of the existing portfolio analysis. So that'll be the bulk of what we're sharing with you today, is the existing portfolio analysis. And we're just getting started into the future portfolios. So just to make sure everyone understands that the outcomes and recommendations, conclusions from the analysis that we'll share with you today are really just the beginning, and really just looking at the city's existing supplies more so than evaluating potential future supplies. So once we meet with you again in October, we will have had an opportunity to work through the future portfolio analysis, and with your input, we'll optimize the recommendations from that analysis. And then when we present to you in January, we will have an administrative draft for your enhanced urban water management plan, with the final being submitted to City Council for adoption in April. Next slide. So today we're going to be looking for Water Commission feedback on several topics, and we'll get more into each of these topics as we work through the presentation. So we're looking for your feedback on the 5 pillars of Water Vision Santa Barbara, and we'll show you what those are here in a second. As I mentioned, we've completed the demand analysis, so we'll be looking for feedback on our demand projections. And then we also, as I mentioned, through our existing portfolio analysis, we're looking at supply risks and uncertainties. So we'll want to get your feedback there, the remainder of the existing portfolio analysis, and then help advise as we move forward into looking at future portfolios. So these are kind of the key areas of feedback that we're looking for from the Commission. Next slide. So I'll turn it over to Tiffany, who is our strategic communications lead and the outreach and communications lead for Water Vision Santa Barbara. And she'll talk with us a bit about the stakeholder engagement and communication process so far. Tiffany?
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, commissioners and members of the public. I'm excited to be with you all again today. We're going to talk about just a few things. The first two are really kind of a recap since we talked in April, kind of a regrounding and the engagement approach that we're taking, and the makeup of the stakeholder group. We've had a few changes since we met in April. And then we're really gonna dive into the progress to date. As you saw from the schedule that Jeff just shared, we've actually had 3 workshops since we last spoke, 3 out of 5. So quite a bit of work with the stakeholders has been done over the last couple of months. And then we're gonna then focus on a summary of the first workshop, really what we're calling the 5 pillars driving Water Vision Santa Barbara, and really are going to be asking for your input into those 5 pillars today. And then lastly, a little later on in the presentation, Jeff's going to kind of give a synopsis of the 3 topics that we dove into in the 3rd workshop, and give you an opportunity to dig into those if that makes sense to do so in this conversation. We'll have a summary of that workshop a little bit later. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So as a quick reminder, we've divided our approach into essentially 4 groups that are based on the role that each of these groups play. The stakeholder group and the general public, their role is pretty similar. While the stakeholder group has kind of more of a direct involvement, both of them, their role is to share their perceptions, the values, needs, and concerns of themselves or their constituents. And of course, the role of Water Commission is to serve as that advisor to City Council, and City Council will make that final decision on the urban water management plan that comes from our work. So just a regrounding in that. And as you know, if you can move to the next slide, we developed a group of stakeholders, pretty arduous process, and got some input from Water Commission and City Council on the initial list back in April. And this is an update of the list. We now have 28 organizations representing the 9 different constituent segments you see on this table. Because of COVID, since April, of course, quite a few organizations listed here are on the front lines of COVID. You can see Cottage Health, the Santa Barbara Zoo, the school district, and a few others over time that have been listed as inactive, primarily because of COVID. They just can't commit the time, but have very specifically asked to stay involved and stay apprised of our progress and still have the opportunity to provide input at key milestones. And they've been very enthusiastically doing that so far. We think that, the fact that if we look at one of these segments with large water users as mostly inactive, it obviously presents some semblance of a risk to the stakeholder engagement. But again, so far they've really been actively engaged in our ongoing communications post-workshop, and we'll have the opportunity to watch any of those workshops as they're recorded. Chair Keller, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question. So they are, even though they're inactive in participating in some of the workshops, you have been in contact, and just to reiterate,
That's
they
right.
have been giving you feedback.
Yes, where they can. And so we do a lot of pre and post workshop communications by email.
Okay.
And so they've received all of those communications. They continue to be invited to the workshops. They receive the links to the recordings. And as you'll see in a minute, we're doing summaries after the workshop. So they also have an opportunity to weigh in at that point. Most of them have not taken that action because of just resource and time constraints, but they have that opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
And one other point I wanted to make within the human rights to water category, we had some feedback early in the process that we really wanted to better represent that group and have more persons of color represented in that group in particular. So Dakota worked really hard to really kind of rethink that group and get better representation of African American community and Asian communities. So we've added a representative from the Black Lives Matter Santa Barbara, as well as an organization called Healing Justice, and from UCSB, the Pan Asian Network. So that latter group is representing the student population in Santa Barbara as well. So I'm happy to answer more questions about this in the Q&A section, but just wanted to give you an update on where that group sits. We have about 20 that are actively, very consistently participating in workshops and any of our follow-up. Let's go to the next slide. Go ahead and keep clicking. I think there's some animation in there. There you go. So we've hosted 3 out of 5 workshops to date, all virtually, of course. And the first workshop held back in May, Water Management 101, was mostly educational and presentation out. And it was really designed to set a baseline of shared knowledge of what goes into creating a water plan, because we have a lot of members that have never done this work before. So we wanted to create that baseline knowledge. Though in that workshop, stakeholders did immediately provide us some really great feedback on how they'd like to work together moving forward. Simple things like, let's not use GoToWebinar. Let's make sure we use Zoom so it's as interactive as possible. So we immediately acted on that. And then also thinking about different times of day in reaction to COVID. Rather than have our typical evening workshop, we moved all the workshops to kind of a 9 to 5 type of workday time frame. And that's been working out a lot better. So in workshop number 2, which was far more interactive, community values and needs, we were able to take the information acquired from this workshop as well as the one-on-one interviews that we held with the vast majority of the group members. And we acquired quite a bit of knowledge and input on perspectives, values, concerns facing community constituents, as well as really fantastic ideas for addressing some of the challenges that we face with our water supply and ensuring that equitable, affordable access to water, and how the community really wants to play an even bigger role in water conservation and water use efficiency. So from that workshop, we developed our first summary, our stakeholder perception summary, where we captured what we heard, and then we translated that into a working set of values and guiding principles that we're calling the 5 pillars. And I'm going to share that with you in just a minute. But our intention is that these 5 pillars coming out of that workshop would serve as guiding principles to inform the Water Vision work, not only by the project team, but also by Water Commission and City Council. So we'll walk you through that in just a second. The third workshop last week, we facilitated future supply considerations. And in this workshop, we broke into 3 groups to go do a deeper dive into 3 key questions that would help inform those future water portfolios. And we'll have a summary of that workshop within the next few weeks, and we'll deliver it again to the Water Commission and City Council. It'll be published on the website, just like the first one. But later in the presentation, Jeff and I will share a little bit more about what those 3 questions were. on a preview of some of the themes that we heard across those conversations, because they were, I think we can all safely say they were robust and in some cases just generated a lot of really valuable input. So next, I want to take a few minutes to walk you through our summary of workshop number 2 and the resulting 5 pillars that, as I mentioned, we hope to guide the water vision that will be developing. Note that it is identified as a draft. It's still under review by the stakeholder group through this Friday. So just to recap, go ahead and keep clicking so we have everything on that slide appear. The goals for this workshop, sorry, I can go back one, there you go. Were to document the water-related values that are most important to Santa Barbara's constituents, and knowing that this group, they're serving as a proxy for their entire stakeholder constituent group. So obviously their perspective is limited on their individual experience, but we wanted to document their perception of those values, and then also document how Santa Barbara's constituents define social, environmental, and economic value. As we take this triple bottom line approach to creating this water vision, it's really important to let the community really kind of interpret and define what's most important to them in those 3 kind of categories. And so we wanted to do that here. So next slide. So in this workshop that was really, I'm going to just kind of read the slide, that was attended by members of the stakeholder group. They participated in 2 interactive exercises. And the first one was called this cover story. And in this case, we just took a kind of a creative way to really help get closer to what values are most important to the constituents. And so they answered this question: if we get Santa Barbara's water vision right, what's the story that gets published far into the future? And most importantly, what values does that story express? And that the values piece is really what we were trying to unpack further. So the next couple of slides are really just a quick snapshot or screenshot. If you can go ahead and click through to the next slide, you can kind of see in these next 3, each one, go ahead to the next one. Each one looks a little different in the approach that we took. But ultimately the discussions kind of came back to some consistent themes. In the lower right, what values does your story express? When we looked across those 3 report outs, if you can go to the next slide, we saw some pretty consistent values expressed. There's a lot of values on this slide, but ultimately I think they kind of reflect the earlier vision for the project that Jeff expressed early on. And they also very importantly start to align with the One Water vision that the city is leading. So there's a lot of correlation here between what we're already intending to do and what the community is saying is important to them. So I think that's really good. That's really positive. So the other thing that came out of this is we dove into a second exercise, if you can go to the next slide, that was called the community outcomes exercise. And this is where we dove into really asking the group to define what is important to you when we think about those social, environmental, and economic outcomes. We didn't use the phrase triple bottom line because that's can be kind of jargony, but we dove into 3 key questions, and again, broke into those same small groups. If you can go to the next slide. And each group, you can see a snapshot here of kind of where they took their conversations. So the first question was, if we succeed, how will Water Vision support environmental health? The second question was, if we succeed, how will it look to ratepayers? And then the third one, and that's that economic piece. And then the third one, which is the social piece, if we succeed, how will Water Vision benefit the community? And we set that one up, you see on the lower right bottom of that square, we set that one up thinking about if there's a spectrum, thinking about that social benefit and social impact of the Water Vision. If one end of the spectrum is the Water Vision meets basic human rights to water, basic human needs for water, and the other end of the spectrum is optimum quality of life, which we know is really important to Santa Barbara, community members and businesses, to the tourism industry. Where on that spectrum do we want to kind of land? Is it right in the middle? Is it far over to the optimum quality of life? So that's kind of where those conversations went. And if you can click to the next one, and the one after that, you can see that we just had a variety of kind of input across these different organizations. And in this workshop, we divided each group so we had diverse representation across those segments in each group. We kind of selected those groups for them. So what do we do with this? So our job was really to share out, here's what we heard from you, and that's what that earlier summary is. But then we also needed to translate it into a working set of principles that the project team, City Council, Water Commission could consistently use as kind of some checks and balances through the future milestones and decisions of this process. So we developed what we're calling the 5 pillars informing Water Vision Santa Barbara. And so the intention here is to, wherever possible, give equal consideration to all 5. And some of them are going to be more relevant to certain decisions than others. But basically, here's the 5. The cost of water is affordable, equitable, and just. And by just, we mean environmentally just, socially just, economically just. Access to water is reliable and resilient. The impact of our water decisions on the environment and community members is minimized. And by there, we mean, maybe it goes without saying, the negative impact. The community's water is valued and conserved. And 5, our water decisions responsibly support quality of life. We've put this summary out to the stakeholders. They've already had 1 round of input. And like I mentioned, by end of day tomorrow, they're going to give us hopefully their thumbs up to publish this. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of correlation, natural correlation to the One Water Vision, but I wanted to hand it over to Joshua to really kind of put a fine point on that, since he's obviously been more directly connected to that effort. So Joshua, any remarks on that?
So 2 meetings ago, we introduced One Water to our stakeholder group. And as you recall, this was a conversation at Water Commission in May. One of the reasons we were so excited to introduce it is we felt like it's very aligned with what we're doing here with the stakeholder group and with the update to our long-term water supply plan. So there was a lot of, I think, positive feedback from the group. And I think this term was fairly new to a lot of them, but just understanding that the approach here is we want to come up with a way in which we are approaching water in a holistic way, not just looking at just the economics or just water quality, but actually all of the ways in which we interact with water. And so we sat down with them, we talked about the fact that all of our water in our community has value, no matter what state it is in. And the fact that we have value management in an inclusive and sustainable way. We wish to be leaders in environmental stewardship and sustainability, a focus on customers, education and partnership, along with transparency, and of course, striking that balance of collaboration and trying to break down some of these barriers that have been put up by regulations or funding or whatever it is, and trying to break down those barriers between water, wastewater, energy, recreation, and environmental protection. So I think it was a good introduction. It's a lot for anybody to take on initially, but this is a theme that's going to continue to evolve through water resources as a culture, but I think it's also going to continue to be part of our conversation with our stakeholder group, and of course our public meetings, and as we continue to develop this plan. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. This might be the end. Yeah. So at this stage, we would like to ask for feedback on the 5 pillars, but I know it's a lot to digest immediately, and also knowing that the stakeholder group is completing their review through tomorrow. But at this point, Chair Keller, do we want to open it up for some discussion with the commissioners in response to those 5 pillars, or we can save that to the end?
I believe
Okay.
so. Go back a couple
yeah,
slides?
go back to that 5 pillars slide.
Yes, Kristen, do you have a comment or question? Back one more slide to the 5 pillars.
There you go.
Thank you, Chair Keller. I do have just a quick
two quick comments, actually. One, excellent. This is really excellent work, and thank you. It's really hard to pull all those stakeholders together and have it coalesce into something meaningful, and you've done that here and communicated it well. Thank you. So I think pillar 3 is worded awkwardly, and you reworded it as you presented it. So I think it should stand alone and not have to be explained. It's just that it, and I guess reword it in the positive and not the negative. So, however, you're the expert on that. So, but
I
it
hear
should,
you though. Yeah.
stand alone on that. And then I know it's very late in the game for this, looking at that stakeholder group. And I think we saw the list before, but it just occurs to me looking at it, and this is, well, maybe not a small thing, but with the neighborhood, it's 11%, and you have the neighborhood impacts, neighborhood community leaders, I think it said. And you have the Mission Canyon Neighborhood Association, which is largely a lot of county members.
It is, yeah.
But then you don't have Riviera Association or Eucalyptus Hill or Upper East or some that are more city focused. So I think it would be worthwhile to reach out to the Riviera Association membership, just for or however you want to handle that. But it does stand out to me that you have Mission Canyon, but not Riviera.
Right. And I think Joshua can probably speak to that. Yeah.
So Chair Keller, Councilmember Sneddon, it's a great comment. And when we did kind of discuss that early on is how to get this. So one of the things with our stakeholders is the majority of them they live in our neighborhood. So as they are representing their groups, they are living in various pockets. And at this point, we didn't ask which neighborhood they lived in, but when we went through, we tried to get groups that that kind of represented neighborhoods in general. The one exception we made with Mission Canyon was they have no council representation, but they are a customer. And so, without getting in and identifying every single one of them, that is really their seat and voicing their particular concerns, because they have a lot of unique concerns of fire and in their neighborhood. And because they don't have a council representative, we felt it, a means of giving them a voice in which normally they would have no voice. But we didn't, without getting into trying to get the Mesa neighborhood and everybody involved, we kind of went to pick some of these larger groups. And then of course, all of our constituents, or the good portion of them, are represented as residents as well. And so I hope that kind of, it is a little better explanation of why we didn't have each one of these neighborhoods right.
This is very helpful. So in the Mission Canyon, I just want to clarify. So that was mainly water customers, but not necessarily city residents. Is that what the target of that stakeholder group?
That's why we included them, because they really have no voice otherwise. Where all this is going to come through Water Commission and City Council, and of course, we're going to have a public process as well. If there are neighborhoods that are feeling like their voice isn't heard, there are numerous ways in which they can be heard, where Mission Canyon is kind of they have a very limited way of communicating their specific concerns.
Yeah.
Thank you. Overall, I think this is a really excellent process, and really appreciate these 5 pillars. And I really appreciate how they dovetail with One Water. And just another note that the new logo with the 3 colors representing the 3 types of water and the different ways of use coming out of the tap and in different places is really emphasizing that as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from commissioners?
I have a question on the first pillar, and it has to do with how we consider or define affordable and equitable and just. Affordable, of course, depends a lot on your income and your ability to afford it, to pay for it. And so that's going to be a big challenge, because we have very, very different levels of ability to pay for water. So someone may think it's very affordable, and other people are screaming and shouting because they don't think so. And then the other one is we have our conservation program really is focused on helping give economic incentives or price signals. So if you are conserving water, you get more affordable water. If you are wasting water, you're paying a lot more for that water. And I think how do we balance that? And someone that may be paying a very large bill, it may be just because they're using a lot of water and they may think it's not affordable, but it's or equitable, but it's because it's not meant to promote large consumption. So just to think about that and how we handle that. Huh?
Those are all really great questions. And I think they're actually a really good segue for the latter part of the conversation, because we dove into some of those core questions in workshop number 3. And, one thing that there's going to be, I think, recommendations that come out of this stakeholder engagement process that inevitably fall outside of the scope of developing the plan, but are really important considerations for us to recirculate to Water Commission. And a good example of that we isn't necessarily in our purview as a project team to solve is that question of affordability. And I think that the key trend and the message that the stakeholder group is expressing, that I'm sure you're well aware of, is that the cost of water is directly tied into the affordability in general in Santa Barbara. And most vulnerable populations, we need to pull the actual data, hard data, to kind of validate this. But most of the vulnerable populations don't necessarily have access to their water bill. It's folded into their cost of rent, for instance. And so there's things like that I think are really great insights, where we have an opportunity to provide more education. We have more opportunity to maybe really consider what's called the lived reality of vulnerable populations when it comes to how we set rates. And there may not be anything we can do about it. And I think we've been really clear with stakeholders of where our job is to really communicate that stuff back to Water Commission and City Council. So in that case, I think when we get into seeing some of those key trends, it'll be really valuable. Joshua, did you have another thought to add to that?
I was just saying you're doing a very good job of explaining it, that there is, and this is stuff that we've definitely have struggled with when it comes to rates. And I think we have a lot of good things in place, but recognizing that there are a lot of our vulnerable community that, you're correct, do not have a water bill, have no control over their usage. They have no impact on it. It's basically baked into their rent. And so there's a lot of lack of knowledge, access to knowledge. And I think there's opportunities there to, certainly as these projects, as apartments are replaced, they have to now put in meters. But I think there's, what do you do with all the housing stock that doesn't have, or those multi-unit places that don't have that? The other element that we heard as well is that you have constituents that have multiple families in one house, and their water usage may be low, but there's so many people in one house that their water bill is actually pretty high. So lots of good dialogue, and I think we have things in place. And I think as we talk more about rates, we can talk about some of the challenges of that. I think, you get into trying to count how many people live in a house, and there are obviously concerns. Some people don't want to be counted in that case, maybe are living here illegally, and there's some other, sensitive community issues that we're dealing with. And so all of those are great feedback that I think we're getting, and I think we're trying to make sure that we're documenting in that, and that's going to be part of it's not necessarily all a supply discussion, but an element maybe of our rate discussion that we need to do a better job of discussing and communicating.
And one key point I wanted to add to that, to address your question, was sometimes there's a misunderstanding because the word equity is used a lot now, but it's not necessarily, there isn't necessarily a common understanding of what equity means. And so in our case, we're using the strict actual definition of it's fair, it's not equal. So, and I think our job is really, again, to kind of surface what feels fair and what's kind of that lived reality of fair and affordable for the vast majority of your residents and business owners, the people who are your water customers. And in those cases where that, again, like maybe the lived reality of the solution to providing affordability and equitability, also encouraging conservation, if it isn't really looking at more of a small sector of the population, and is there an opportunity to actually extend that, those incentives in new ways to a broader population? But back to you guys. Additional questions?
Commissioner Young?
Yeah, thank you. Tiffany, great work. And looks like a great comprehensive plan and a tremendous stakeholder outreach. I mean, I compliment you for that. Just a question I have on pillar 2. Is there a difference between reliability and resiliency, or are they one of the same?
You know, it's a good question. And maybe Joshua, you can come back on. I think for me, I think about reliability as it's always working when we need it. Whereas resilient is thinking about, like, if there is a natural disaster, in that case, it's still working. So maybe there is a lot of consistency. We can pick one of those words. Joshua, what do you think?
No, Tiffany, I think you did a great job of kind of defining how we look at that. So reliability is how the ability of the water system to deliver water day in and day out and be there. And then the resiliency is its ability to weather different situations, whether they be natural disasters primarily, and be able to continue to provide water, at least to meet health and safety for the community.
Right. I teach on this topic, so so
go for it. Here we go.
Reliable, you may be 98% reliable, so by and large 99.9% reliable. So almost always you're there. But there's that one big event that causes you to have a big down or big up or whatever, and that's the ability to bounce back is the resiliency. So they're different in that sense. So it's the ability to bounce back to wherever the condition you want to be. I think that's the main difference.
Oh, well said.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other comments or questions on the 5 pillars or the rest of that portion of our presentation?
I think we can move forward.
Okay, great. So Jeff, I'll hand it back to you. Jeff is going to provide some of the overview of the more technical content.
Okay, thanks, Tiffany. So let's get into some of the technical aspects of the work so far. This is a graphic that you have seen before, sort of showing the technical process that we're moving through on the project. The planning basis was first, we looked at objectives and level of service goals, evaluation criteria for looking at different supply sources, and parameters around our risk and uncertainty analysis. And we dove into our existing system analysis, and that's the portion that we wanted to highlight here in our presentation to you. So as it relates to the existing system analysis, we wanted to talk a bit about the methods that we've used, the analysis that we've conducted, some of the conclusions and findings that we found so far, and what next steps look like for this process. And the idea is that back to the prior slide. The idea is that the existing system analysis and then also a look at water supply options will lead into a more comprehensive look at future portfolios. So this existing system analysis is really the first step in moving into a vision for the future of the city of Santa Barbara's water resources. And then from that portfolio analysis, we'll look at top portfolios, and portfolios are collections of water supplies. I should have made that clear. And through that scoring process of portfolios, we'll develop a list of our top recommended portfolios based upon a triple bottom line analysis and risk scores, which I'll talk a bit more in a second. Work through sensitivity analysis, resiliency scenarios to test those portfolios against some of the resilience scenarios that we were chatting about earlier to come up with a recommended portfolio. And then that leads to an adaptive implementation plan, which will be reflected in the city's enhanced urban water management plan. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we've got some fun stuff to share. So I'll jump right into it. Next slide. So the method, first things first, we needed to understand what the city's water demands will look like into the future. So we developed a projection of demand, and we're calling that demand envelope, and I'll explain that more in a minute. We also looked at existing supplies. So looking at number 3 there, simulating baseline supplies. So that's really looking at the city's status quo, existing supplies, current conditions. And then we looked at number 2 there is the risk and uncertainty analysis. So we said, okay, what are some of the risks associated with the city's existing supplies, and how might that risk and uncertainty affect the availability of those supplies? And then we simulated a risk-adjusted portfolio, existing system portfolio, and then looked at supply-demand comparisons using those baseline and risk-adjusted supply portfolios over the historic hydrology, and then also over design drought, which we'll get into more in a second. So that's the basic method, and I'll walk through each of these steps as we move along. So next slide. First, we'll talk about the demand projections. So this graph shows the dotted line represents total water demand in the city from about 2005. So this is actual data of water use. You can see during the drought, water use declined pretty significantly. The gray, sort of the light gray line extending from about 2010, those were the water demand projections that were included in the 2011 long-term water supply plan. So you can kind of see what demands did with the extended drought, the unprecedented drought, relative to what that prior plan projected. But what the prior plan showed is kind of a steady decline, really, even with growing population and employment. The last plan projected a decline primarily related to ongoing water conservation, water use efficiency. And then what the black line represents is our current demand projections, our baseline projection. And I'll talk more about that in a second, but you can see the steeper slope in the first 5 years or so, and then a gradual slope into the future. And what that steeper slope represents is a rebound from current levels of demand to what would be more consistent with historical water use. So that represents that rebound, and that's what the slope represents. And then the gradual increase over time really is related to growth in customer base, and the combined effect of growth in customer base with changes in demand patterns on a per capita basis. Next slide, and this will be a build, and Chair Keller, I do want to address any question you have, but just to explain, I'm sorry, go back. There's a gap that I wanted to explain. So there. So you can see that jump between the historical and what we're projecting is really the Montecito Water Supply Agreement. And just to clarify, the dotted line and the black line includes recycled water. So it's total water use, not just potable demand, but also non-potable demand within the existing service area. So Chair Keller, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. When I first looked at this, we see how the Montecito Water Supply Agreement, that makes sense to me. And then we jump up, we have this trend going back up. I'm not completely convinced that we're going to go all the way back up, but still. But the difference between the 2011 projection and your kind of flattening out is basically the Montecito. Is that correct?
That's the big difference. Although there are a lot of nuances in the demand projection. So maybe if we can go to the next couple of slides, I can explain a bit more detail.
I think Commissioner Davis has a question as well. So
he may be there. It may be answered in the next question, but within at least the staff report, you talked another nuance here with 1,000 acre feet of blended potable into the recycle program. At least I saw that in a note. Is that correct? And you know, maybe Joshua, when did that come up? We're looking at 1,000 acre feet of blended.
The 1,000 acre feet is total recycled water demand for the demand projections.
Yeah, that may be a typo. One of the things, so what I think was
it's a pretty big typo.
Yeah, well, I think, and here I think was the challenge is you know, I've been pushing the WSC team to include recycled water in our demands. Usually you talk just about potable water demands, but I've asked them to keep recycled water in here and make it part of our demands, because as I anticipate, we're going to get talking about potable reuse. And it really, at that point, how can you by converting to potable reuse means you're going to have to pick up this recycled water demand somewhere. And so they've went ahead and incorporated that. And maybe it was
It's the way it's presented. It's the way it's presented, because again, given the history we've had here dealing with the blended aspect of that program, when I saw that 1,000 acre feet blended, I'm going, that system now basically over. So yeah, anyway,
Thank you.
I think it's basically how it's presented. Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry.
thank you. And to clarify, we are not blending, unless the facility goes down. The water quality right now is exceptional from recycled water, and we are not having to blend it to meet any type of regulatory requirements. So thank you. That's a good catch. We'll make sure to get that clarified in future communication.
Okay, so let's unpack these demand projections a little more. And so if you go to the next slide, we took that baseline and we looked at, actually these analyses were conducted, the demand analysis was conducted by Madaus. They're a separate consultant that's been working on demand projections for the city. But their analysis looked at the baseline, you can see, that's the same baseline projection line from the prior slide. And then they looked at a couple of variables that could potentially change. So what if there was a higher growth in residential development than what was predicted in the baseline? And then what about a faster job growth or a slower job growth? And then also, I think, Chair Keller, to your point, what if there is less of a rebound from the drought? And what this kind of showed is that the population growth really doesn't have a huge impact on long-term projections. And the primary reason is that if we look at increased population growth, that increased population growth is primarily coming in the form of multifamily housing units, which are much more efficient on a per capita basis. So we don't see the same kind of a proportional increase in demands associated with population growth to the same extent that we see from job growth as an alternative example. So you can see kind of the spread there with that top kind of orange line with the faster job growth and the blue line, which is a lower job growth. And with a lower job growth, what ends up happening is that sort of ongoing water conservation associated with water code enhancements and retrofits to existing facilities, homes, and businesses, that there is a slight declining trend, that sort of the conservation offsets any growth in employment and population. So you see a slight declining trend on that blue line. So that kind of shows some of the bounds that we looked at. And then if you apply that slower growth rate, I should explain the lower drought rebound. So the idea here is that perhaps many of the existing behaviors and improvements that have been made within the existing water system to improve water use efficiency, perhaps more of those improvements and those changes in behavior are permanent. And if that's the case, then we won't see as much of a rebound on a per capita basis from the drought conditions back to something more similar to pre-drought. So we wanted to look at that lower drought rebound, and that's what that green line represents. And let's go one more slide, and then I'll be interested in some questions here. So then what that ends up representing is an envelope, projection envelope of what we expect the demands to fall within in the future. And that's kind of this gray area. And what you see below the lower drought rebound line, the green line, there's a lower line, and that represents slower job growth. So if we had a lower drought rebound and lower job growth, that would be kind of the lower bound of our demand envelope. So that demand envelope, if you look out to 2050, it's between like 12,000 and 16,000 acre feet per year, which is not unprecedented in terms of total water use within the city pre-drought. So with that, open any questions you have on this topic.
Thank you very much. I think that clarified a lot of my questions. Just one question from me. Well, one question, one comment. The first one is on job growth. What's the assumption that makes it have such a huge impact? Is these jobs that require water because people are coming, for example, and using facilities here, they're not necessarily residents, but they're using water for other reasons?
No, it's a good point. And it just goes to show that the jobs in Santa Barbara, so the population that comes into Santa Barbara to work, is a significant component of your water demand. So if you look at higher jobs in the city, you're going to see greater demands. And the bounds of that, higher versus lower, that's a question that I can get back to you on. I don't know the details of that. Maybe Rob, if you're on the line, you can weigh in on the assumptions that were used for job growth.
Okay.
Is Rob on the line?
Yeah, this is Rob. Hello, everybody. So the Madaus demand model is using California economic development numbers. I think it's about a little 1.2% growth per year, and we just looked at plus or minus 20% to that rate to get those bounds, and it assumes the same water makeup of the existing jobs. So that's the biggest. That's an unknown going forward. Is the jobs going forward? What's the water intensity? Are they in hotels? Are they in offices? You know, et cetera. So that's the gray area in some of the projections related to jobs.
And then my only comment, if we can go back one slide, the kink that we see, I think, is around 2028. It's an artificial kink. It must be something in the projections. And it's always people wonder why we have this break. So it may be better just to show it, smooth it out. It's just a comment. I think it makes it easier for people to sort of see a smooth curve at that point rather than a kink there. But anyway, so Councilmember Sneddon, do you have a comment or question?
I do. Thank you, Chair Keller. So I had that same question about, I mean, it's maybe it should be put on this graph at some point too. I mean, when you say something like slower job growth is better for water and higher job growth, I think quantifying that becomes really important, especially if we're making sort of broad statements like the population of the city doesn't matter, but that the job growth numbers do, and that has pretty serious implications. I mean, before you bring this to council, there's pretty serious implications for housing decisions, economic development decisions, all types of repercussions from those types of projections. So I think it's really important that what those assumptions are built in, and which industries those are. Even though I can see here, you know, slower and faster compared to current, or just more detail in the captioning of that, I think for the public, and certainly before it comes to council, descriptions on that would be helpful.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think we referenced the California EDD as the source of our job data. I think we can give more, maybe potentially additional explanation on the plus or minus 20%. And that might be something that we dig into a little deeper if that's the right range that we want to use there. But really good points that we can clarify those in our presentation to council.
Thank you. And I'll leave that to Water Commission too, to give recommendations on how or what, but that's just my impression looking at it, that those are sort of red flag type words when you talk about job growth or residential growth, how it impacts water.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Commissioner Young?
Thank you, Chair Keller. I'm looking for some discussion of how drought-related water usage restrictions overlay this. And so I do see a discussion here about conservation program, new plumbing fixtures, things like that. But over that period of time, we're going to have more drought periods, greater, less rainfall. So how do we look at the restrictions that we expect to have handed down by the state? And how does that overlay with this demand? I mean, I look at this and it appears to me, I don't see that factor in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what you're referring to, I think, is extraordinary conservation during drought periods. So yes. When there are drought periods, there's additional conservation that's required in some instances by the local municipality or by the state. And those aren't reflected, those extraordinary conservation measures are not reflected in these projections. We handle that really as when we look at supply. So when we look at supply, we're looking at meeting these baseline projections of demand. And then if supplies are insufficient to meet those demands, then there is a component of additional conservation that's required basically to make up the gap. And I can show you when we get into the supply analysis kind of how that works.
Okay.
The kind of the drought related, what we're calling extraordinary conservation is not reflected in these projections. That's really on a case by case basis, and it comes out in this more extended period analysis that I'll show you here in a second.
Okay, but they are included in the
Yes.
other analysis that you have.
That's right.
Because although we call them extraordinary, they are going to repeat themselves. We are going to have more drought periods of time with reduced rainfall. And the state is going to impose, in their tiered process, additional restrictions in water usage. So
That's right. I think right now we're calling them, initially we were calling them mandatory conservation, but then we realized that perhaps there's mandatory conservation that's really built into the baseline projections, and there certainly is changes in the plumbing code and local ordinances and that sort of thing. But beyond that, when you look at drought conditions, there's something more. There's an additional level of conservation, and so we've talked about what words to use. Currently, we're using the word extraordinary conservation, but I think you make a great point that chances are the restrictions will come back. And so maybe they're not extraordinary, but maybe they're additional or mandated or something along those lines. I'd be interested in, Dakota, your comments on that.
Sure. I just wanted to point out to Jeff that the Madaus demand projections actually did look at the legislation that's coming from the state currently. So we have, I think it's SB 606 or 616, which was making conservation a way of life in California. And those regulations aren't entirely spelled out yet by the state. They're still working on what those targets and requirements are going to be. So to the best of our ability with the information we have, Madaus did include those regulations in this demand projection. And then moving forward with this envelope, what's nice is it kind of gives us an area within which to make decisions. And so as future regulations come out from the state, we can look at where we're trending in our demand projection within this envelope, and then that's going to help us identify decision points in terms of what we need to do with supply. So we are thinking about those future regulations, and we're incorporating them to the best that we can. However, not all of them have really been defined by the state yet.
Good, thank you.
Commissioner Davis?
Yes, I had a question in the staff report, and I think referenced here too. There's a city's water conservation strategic plan by MWM. Again, when I read through this, I had more and more questions as to wanting to look at that. It says that's underway. First question is, what's the process for getting that out so that we can see the results of that?
Commissioner Keller and Commissioner Davis, that's a really good question. So the water conservation staff is working concurrently with the efforts that are underway for the enhanced urban water management plan on this water conservation strategic plan. They currently have a draft of the report that they are finalizing. And then I believe that will be coming to Water Commission in the early fall for your review. So we're working closely with that team to make sure that our plans have the same data and are working from the same points, but they are working side by side. So hopefully you'll get to see that report soon.
Great. And timing, how this all works out timing wise is a question in my mind. I have the same question with respect to the difference between water conservation and water use efficiency measures. You take the permanent things like plumbing code things versus behavioral aspects of saving water. And it just becomes a cloud, especially when you get into looking at projecting for long-term demand. In the staff report, and it might have been in the technical memorandum, which was the attachment, it talks about the city has selected to implement Plan B. And there's no discussion as to what Plan A was or Plan B was, at least in the staff report. Might be coming out of the strategic plan on conservation. But it talks about there about with the city has selected to implement Plan B with 17 measures. And again, all of that affects the demand curve. I'm just questioning as to, how does this, reading the staff report, looking at the presentation, looking at where we're going, how does this all come together?
Chair Keller and Commissioner Davis, again, that's a really great question. And you're correct that is coming out of that water conservation strategic plan. One thing that I can tell you prior to, providing that plan as a report to Water Commission is that the Madaus water management team that's working on the water conservation strategic plan has a decision support model. They call it their DSS model. That is actually really pretty microscopic in how it breaks down effects on demand. And so you mentioned the difference between like the plumbing code versus individual behavior. And the DSS model actually looks at each of those items as individual items and their effect on water conservation and demands in the future. And so I'm hearing some need to present that water conservation strategic plan so that we have more of this background information, and we'll definitely work to get that to you soon.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much on that. I'll save my other questions for later because they relate to other things, but I'll let you finish this section. Go ahead. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. I think we're going to be ready to move on to the next part, unless there's any. Yeah.
Great. Let's thank you. Let's continue to move forward here then.
Hey, Jeff, I just wanted to check in really quick. I feel like we're about halfway through our discussion, and I just wanted to check in because I think we're committed as this staff and Jeff at your level to continue the discussion past 11. But I just want to make sure that there's not a hard stop by any of the commissioners at this point, because I do think we want to get through this information and we want to give it the time, because this conversation we're having so far is great. This is exactly kind of the discussion I was hoping for, and I don't want to rush it. So I just wanted to check in with Chair, any of the commissioners, whether they have any issues.
Well, I'm fine with going over any commissioner or council member Sneddon. I know Commissioner Young has to go to another meeting, but
I'm good until 12.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate all your time. I apologize, but I think this is a good conversation.
I'm going to check and see when they need me for a quorum on the regional water board's agenda. But this is great discussion, and I don't want to leave this. But I'll find out. I'll text them and see what the issue is. But we just continue on with what we're doing.
Okay, so I'll move through this, and I don't want to rush it, but I'll definitely continue to keep the pace going here. But feel free to intervene if you want to stop and ask questions. So you're familiar with this graphic? This is just kind of a cartoon depiction of all of the city's diverse water supplies. It's a pretty amazing collection of supplies the city currently benefits from and has invested in over the decades. They're all depicted here. Next slide. And each of these supply sources kind of has different risks associated with it. So we collected those risks. The next slide. And we plotted them on this risk plot, which basically plots impact of the risk on the y-axis and likelihood of the risk on the x-axis. So what that does is it pushes the higher risk items up into the upper right, and it pulls the lower risk items down in the lower left. So by looking at it on these two axes, likelihood of that risk occurring and the impact of that risk on the city's water supply picture, we've prioritized a few key risks for this stage of the analysis, looking at the risk of increased releases being required from Kachuma, which impacts the available supply for the city. Climate change, obviously, is an important consideration when we draw so much of our water from local watersheds, as well as importing water from statewide watersheds. And then sedimentation in Gibraltar, a very specific concern for the city, and an issue that you all are very familiar with. So those three risks. Next slide, please. So we broke those down a bit more and looked at them more closely. So climate change as the first risk. And I think we all understand the science is overwhelmingly indicating that climate change will have a significant impact on long-term water resources in California. And what that really is driving is lots of different impacts. Higher year-to-year variability in rainfall is a big one. So what the science is predicting is longer, more intense droughts and more intense rainfall periods when it's wet. So wetter wet, drier dry. And then the potential for more extreme droughts. So I think our most recent drought is a great example. It was a drought of record, really, and an unprecedented drought in the historical record. And what the science is showing us is that those types of extreme events may become more likely with climate change. And then, as I mentioned, there's the probability of more intense rainfall when those rain events do occur. And I was just reading an article this morning that came out of UCLA summarizing some of the recent modeling that they're doing. They're combining climate modeling with weather modeling and looking at thousands of different sort of scenarios to sort of evaluate what atmospheric river behavior might look like with climate change. And it's fascinating science, but what they're saying is there's a basic impact of increased atmospheric temperatures, and that is that the atmosphere can hold more moisture. So when these atmospheric river events occur and they bring large plumes of moisture into the region, there's more moisture available for precipitation. And there's a whole lot of other impacts that come along with that, but that leads to more intense rainfall. So you have these episodic events, more extreme droughts, and then this higher variability. And since local surface water is the city's cheapest and most readily available supply, the city is going to have to be looking to more expensive, more energy intensive supplemental supplies to provide that drought resilience in the face of climate change. Commissioner Young, do you have a question or a comment?
I do. Thank you very much, Jeff. What do the models show us, and what is the quantification for how climate change is expected to affect our water supply?
It's interesting, and I don't know that there's a single answer to that question. The study I was reading this morning, and I have it open in front of me, came out of the climate science department at UCLA. And what they've done is there are multiple climate models that look at climate patterns broadly. And those climate models really aren't good at kind of granular analysis of individual weather patterns in local areas. They're really more looking at broad climate effects of a warming climate. So what this study has done is it's taken those broad climate models and then used the parameters from those models as inputs into more localized weather predicting models that are used by forecasters and run multiple scenarios. And what that shows is that there's a basic thermodynamic impact associated with higher atmospheric temperatures. As temperatures rise, the moisture capacity of the air rises, and also evaporation and evapotranspiration increases. So those are kind of two big findings. And then as the moisture capacity of the atmosphere increases, then when you do have these high moisture events, atmospheric rivers as an example, large plumes of moisture that come in from the Pacific and then move over land, when you do have those high moisture events, they contain more moisture. So they're contributing more rainfall when it's raining. But then over the extended period, you have more frequent, longer term droughts as well. I can send this link to this article. It's very well written. I think it's very approachable. It's not overly jargon heavy, and it'll give you more details if you're interested. It really focuses most on the effect of atmospheric rivers, and that's really the big driver for water supply in California, as well as flood and water resources management.
Well, let me ask my question another way, if I may. Go back to your prior slide. So why did you put climate change in that spot right there? Why not lower down? Why not to the left? What drives that location in your graph?
Yeah, I think what you'll see when we look at applying these risks to the existing portfolios, if we consider the effect of reductions in precipitation broadly in the watershed and the effect of these episodic events, then the availability of local surface water becomes much more variable, and that drives shortages during drought periods, and you'll see that in the analysis. So it becomes it's a high impact to the water supply. And in terms of likelihood, the reason we ranked it high on likelihood is just because of the science that we continue to follow and that's continuing to evolve. Continues to point in the same direction, that these effects are likely to occur. And in some instances, we're seeing some effects of a warming climate. So it's science is telling us that there's a high likelihood that these conditions will occur into the future, and our analysis shows that the impact of those conditions is high on the city's water resources, so it falls into a high risk category.
Well, I understand that. That's like a qualitative answer. And I'm just wondering if there is a formula that has been used to put those data points in, if I want to call them data points, even though they're labels. So, I mean, I understand how climate's going to change. I understand how we're going to have maybe more severe and prolonged droughts. I understand we're going to have periods of intense rainfall, but how does that numerically factor in to the predictions? And maybe we don't have enough data, but that's what I'm looking for.
So we're actually working on some updated modeling of the St. Anne's River system right now. So we're early. This is looking forward as part of the future portfolio analysis. We are planning more explicitly incorporating into the projections. And so we're not at the stage to present some numerical findings on that yet. But the preliminary findings indicate everything that Jeff has described here. And we're actually building on some of the work that UCSB Bren students did under Commissioner Keller. So they developed some great data this past year using 4 different climate models. And so we're incorporating some of the data into the St. Anne's River model that the city has helped fund. And when we come back in October, we'll have those results, but we just don't have them right now.
All right, thank you.
Okay, but what we can quantify, and we'll move forward here, is looking at the existing supply portfolio relative to the demand projections. But before we get to that, let me just cover these other 2 kind of high risks that were identified. So this one is related to increased releases from Kachuma. So Kachuma is one of the city's least expensive supplies, and regulations require releases from the reservoir to support fish species downstream and water uses downstream. Although the water rights order has been finalized, there is still the possibility that yields could be reduced even further associated with downstream releases. So if there is a determination that additional water is needed in the river downstream, that affects the city's ability to draw water from Kachuma. So that's the reduced average year yield. And then potentially reduced drought year yield. If additional releases are needed to maintain fish survivability in the St. Anne's River, then that impacts drought supplies. And then additionally, the carryover storage really becomes an important buffer. And if that's impacted because of additional downstream releases, that could have a significant impact on the available supply from Kachuma. So the key takeaway is that the city over time, if these risks materialize, and we're calling this a high risk, the city will have more increased reliance on additional supplemental supplies for drought conditions. Next slide. And then finally, the sedimentation in Gibraltar. So the Gibraltar Reservoir has captured historically large amounts of sediment from the watershed. It continues to accumulate sediment from the watershed, exacerbated by fires and large rainfall events. And what that does is it just accelerates a reduction of yield from Gibraltar. So the key takeaway there is that, and what we've seen from prior studies conducted by the city and the county and others, is that increasing the capacity of the reservoir really isn't cost effective through dredging or raising. And really what's needed is a federal contract amendment, a federal contract for the WARN Act to replace the same volume that was available at Gibraltar historically with withdrawals at Kachuma. So there is a pass-through agreement that sets up that framework, but that WARN Act contract really is needed to finalize the city's ability to operate the reservoirs in that way. So next slide. So open to any feedback on the risk analysis, the risk characterization piece before we dive into existing portfolio analysis.
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions or Council Member Snyder? Commissioner Davis?
I didn't hear any mention relative to state water and the effect of climate change or any of these other issues, state demand, the tunnels, the whole nine. I hadn't heard any discussion relative to our deliveries of state water.
Yeah, and we will be talking about state water deliveries in a second. And that's one of the risk scenarios that we looked at was potential reductions in state water availability so due to delta conveyance and other considerations.
Yeah, I just
I would
didn't see
call
that.
a high likelihood event.
Yeah, I didn't see that in the risk analysis, at least called out per se, absorbed by climate change and other things, but just a point of note.
Good point. Thank you.
Anyone else? I think it was very clear. Thank you very much. So I think we can move forward.
Great. Let's dive into the simulated water supply availability. So as I mentioned before, this is really just the first step. We're looking at the city's existing supplies. We're making some simplifying assumptions. But the idea here is to look at the existing portfolio and really test it to understand where its vulnerabilities are so that we can be informed moving into an evaluation of potential future supplies. So here are some of the assumptions that we used for our existing supply simulation. We looked at the historical period of record from 1942 to 2019 as to look at hydrologic conditions. We assumed 100 acre feet per year of recycled water. That's approximately the city's existing recycled water demand. So we didn't vary that. The Mission Tunnel and Gibraltar and Kachuma, we used historical hydrology. For Gibraltar, we used the existing reservoir capacity, so we didn't include sort of ongoing sedimentation in the baseline analysis. And then with Kachuma, we included the new water rights order, so the requirements for releases under the new water rights order are included there. For the groundwater basin, we used 1,500 acre feet per year long-term average yield, so that that's not exactly how the basin is operated typically, but we just needed a number to be able to use kind of year over year to sort of evaluate surplus and deficit conditions. So we used a long-term average yield. For desalination, we used the current capacity, about 3,125 acre feet per year. And then as you mentioned, the State Water Project, we used DWR's simulation that was published in 2018, I believe. And they are coming out with a new simulation any day now. And once we get those data, we can incorporate them and update our analysis and evaluation of state water. So very much a hot topic. Thank you for bringing it up. What this excludes is any kind of extraordinary pumping of groundwater from storage above and beyond a long-term average yield. It doesn't include any supplemental water purchase, and it doesn't include what we're calling extraordinary conservation. And we talked quite a bit about that when we were talking about demands. So with all of those, Commissioner Keller, do you have
No, please finish. Please finish.
Okay, so with all of those assumptions, we get to the next slide.
Sorry. Okay. On the Gibraltar, so I understand that for right now you're looking at the historical, but for the future scenarios that you will be preparing in the future, you will be taking into account the diminishing capacity of that reservoir because of sedimentation. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep, and you'll see we've got some graphs later on that shows what that looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is kind of there's a lot going on in this graph, and so I'll take a second to unpack it first. But basically what this is this is the historical record from 1942 to 2019 along the x-axis. And then what you see are stacked columns representing the availability of supply from each of the city's primary supply sources. So the supply sources are listed here on the left, and the colors of the columns represent the various components of the supply. So if you go to the next slide. I'm sorry, go back. I'll walk through. I thought there was another call out there. And then overlaid from those overlaid on top of those supply projections is the demand envelope. So that's the range and demands that we were talking about earlier. And the idea here is to say, okay, with that demand envelope and the existing supply availability, what does that look like across the historical record, given the assumptions that we established? And there's some key takeaways here that there is surplus water available in most years. So you can see that the sum total of the city's available supplies significantly exceeds the projected demand envelope. So that's the surplus supply that's available in most years. But then you also see during these key drought periods, like the late 40s, early 50s, the late 80s, early 90s, and then the more recent drought, you actually have significant shortages. So this boom and bust cycle is a bit of the story of Santa Barbara's water supply and demand. Let's see what else. You can see, let's see. I mean, that's pretty much the big picture story there with this. And I think, let me continue moving into the risk adjusted, and then we can get to questions on these and come back to the slide. So we took
Just a
those
quick
baseline
comment,
projections.
Sorry, a quick comment that I picked up on that one is that if you look at the demand envelope, again, generally we meet it, but there's the envelope. If we were at the higher end of that envelope, we would be needing desal in a number of years. So sometimes we would, or state water, one of those.
Yeah, exactly. Even with the lower, and that's an important point, and I appreciate you clarifying that. Even the lower bound of the demand envelope, we have years of shortage. So those shortages have to be made up with supplemental purchase, as you mentioned, or additional extraordinary conservation above and beyond kind of the baseline projection. Right. So this kind of gave us a quick look, and then we wanted to look at, okay, what happens if we were to adjust that supply simulation, given the risks that we had identified previously? So that doesn't really affect recycled water or the Mission Tunnel, but it does affect Gibraltar and Kachuma. We use 60% of baseline as our estimate here to sort of consolidate several concerns around those supplies, sedimentation, as well as the effects of climate change. And as Rob mentioned, we're going to be doing a much more thorough climate change evaluation, including a watershed-based modeling approach in the next phase of work. But for this initial evaluation of the existing portfolio, we used the 60% of baseline as an approximation for the aggregate impact of those risks on those two supplies. Groundwater and desalination we kept as is, and then state water, as you mentioned, is a big area of concern. We're like I mentioned, we're waiting any day for the state's latest projections, but we took that 62% long-term average down to a 48% average, and that's consistent with what the Central Coast Water Authority is using for their long-term planning as kind of a worst case scenario. So that 48% is the reduction. So with those assumptions, go to the next slide, please. You see what happens to the city's supply portfolio. And it's the same basic story, except that the surplus is significantly diminished. So there is still surplus depending upon where you are in that envelope in many years, but it's significantly diminished from the non-risk adjusted supply simulation. The other thing is that the drought conditions are significantly worsened, which is not a surprise. So you have longer and more significant deficits to address with either supplemental purchase or additional conservation from your customers. So as you might expect, the risk adjusted assumptions make the picture a bit more severe in the sense of looking at differences between supply and demand. Commissioner Keller, do you have a question?
Yes, a quick comment. You put state water project at the top and then desal second. And I wonder if that was something intentional, or I think it may be better to switch those two, put desal at the top, since it's supposed to be something that we don't use on a regular basis. So just to be clear, here it shows that we would need it often, but it just make it a little clearer that, even if we use state water, we probably will need the desal a number of years if we were to be within that demand envelope.
It's a really great point, and it causes me to want to make a clarification that this analysis really is intended to show any kind of prioritization of the supplies. It's
Understood.
really just it's a cumulative look at total supply availability in any given year. So it's not setting any prioritization, but as an optic, I think we could make those changes to
just optically. I think people would see that better.
Okay, Commissioner Davis.
I was just going to support the same motion. I think optically it would be good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. That's an easy fix. Okay, so let's continue to the next slide. So we took the next step here, and this is kind of maybe a little bit above and beyond what what's really needed at this stage in terms of the existing supply evaluation. But we wanted to look at some of the things that you mentioned in terms of prioritization of the various supplies, and we wanted to give you kind of a sneak preview of what's to come when we look at future supply portfolios. So what we did is we looked at.
Did you have a question, comment?
I did. Sorry, I came in late on that from the past slide. Just to another optics question. So if it looks like we had below the supply available in the demand envelope, say in 1950, how did we meet that need in 1950? Or am I not reading that chart right? Is that the current demand envelope?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I should have clarified the analysis. This is really just it's a simulation. It's using the historical record just so we have some variability that reflects how climate patterns change in this vicinity. So we wanted to get that variability, and that's why we're using the historical record. But the demand envelope is really the ultimate projection. So the projections in 2050, I believe, it's that range between 13 and 16,000 acre feet per year. So it's kind of like I don't want to use the word build out, but it's that ultimate demand number. And then these simulated supplies are just using the historical record to kind of come up with some estimate of what they might be over time, what that variability looks like.
That clears that up. Thank you.
No problem. Commissioner Young, do you have a question or comment?
I do. Question. Why did you start with 1942? And would this trend look different if you started, say, in 1990? So 1942 is as far back as we could go with good, reliable data for each of the supply sources. So it was kind of the biggest time period that we could use and have good, reliable data because we wanted to see performance over a long period of time. In terms of the record drought, it wouldn't really change the findings because the record drought is really in the most current period of time in 2015 timeframe. So it wouldn't affect our record drought analysis, but it would, I think, decrease maybe some of the visibility of just the effect that this variability has on the city's water supply and demand. And that's really the take-home point here is that, wow, in most years, the city has plenty of water, but in some years it doesn't. And so really trying to figure out how do you strike that balance between availability and cost and the other values that we're hearing from the stakeholder group. And that's really what our exercise will be in the next phase of work. So I would just point out, I would be cautious in saying that we have, an abundance of water in any given year, because that is a snapshot of what's happening in that year. But in actuality, you have to look at that over a period of time. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that we have a surplus in that year. We're holding back some of that water because we're going to need it in those years when the supply is much lower.
Yeah, the city does have the ability to store some water. It's not a huge amount of storage ability, but you do have ability to store water in the groundwater basin, store water in Kachuma, and then store water through the state project system. So that isn't really reflected in this analysis, but that's an important point.
Well, so then that raises a question. Does that mean that we have the ability, or can we develop the ability to throttle down that supply so that we don't have a surplus that cannot be stored?
So Chair Keller, Commissioner Young, I think I think we let this kind of develop where this is going, is that as part of our plan that we're working on is how can we leverage the city's water rights that are available to us, and in that sense, in those years, for example, some of the stuff that's going to come out of this will likely be, and we are flush with water locally, what could we do to leverage that water right that we have? And so that's going to take us down supporting staff efforts to develop groundwater banking opportunities for the city that we could call upon during dry years. And just that's one example of where Jeff is taking this conversation of showing that, yes, we have these kind of extremes and we expect those extremes to get bigger based on climate change projections. And so how can we, utilizing the city's rights, make the most of those extreme fluctuations? And I think that's, I hear what you're saying about, it seems odd to say we have the surplus, and you're right, it is a year-to-year surplus, but how do we take advantage of, I guess, what we own to help put the city, either its ratepayers, economically, the environment, all those factors into consideration? How do we get the most out of this supply? And I think that what Jeff is trying to get across.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you'll see that we start to foreshadow that as I move through the presentation. When we got to our most recent stakeholder workshop, we asked some high-level questions. And one of the high-level questions we asked, driven by our findings from this analysis, is what does the stakeholder group think can be done to maximize the value of the city's existing assets, whether those assets are water rights or it's water infrastructure? What can be done to maximize the value of the city's existing assets? And we posed that question to the stakeholder group, and that really was allowing us to talk about things like groundwater banking, potentially short-term sales of surplus water by the city, and other strategies. And we're not at the point where we're evaluating those strategies quick. Right now, we're still just focusing on the existing portfolio, but I think your questions are really emphasizing the findings from this stage of the analysis. Those are the right questions to be asking right now.
It is another part of that question, throttling back desal in any given year.
Let me show you a couple of slides. As I mentioned, we took the next step here above and beyond this sort of broad-based simulation. If you go to the next slide.
Hey, hang on one second. I just wanted to chime in, going along with Jeff's comment. Over time, essentially, to say that we were flush with water during all these wet years and what have you, again, over the period, the city always managed that in a conjunctive use type of situation, such that we were kind of not looking at it in a snapshot of 1 year, but over some period of time, how we would manage all of those supplies to balance out demand and supply with the contingencies for future drought. And again, just showing the graph that says, oh, we have lots of water most of the time, that's not how the supply is actually managed. So I was just supporting Jeff's question back there.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And that's consistent with what we're trying to depict here. And really this, not all supplies are created equal, and therefore the ability to store individual supplies, it varies. Your ability to store state water is very different than your ability to store Kachuma water, for example, or groundwater. So there are some limitations into kind of multi-year conjunctive use strategies, but those are the types of considerations we're going to take in the next phase of analysis. This was really just kind of a high-level snapshot of existing portfolio performance so that we can kind of start getting our arms around what are the key issues that we have to face going forward. So if there are no additional questions, I can show you the next piece of the analysis. Go to the next slide. So we kind of took the next step where we looked at prioritization of supplies. So this is really the operational simulation. So looking at, well, what happens if the city were to prioritize one supply over another, and how might that affect the city's ability to weather the design drought? So we took the upper and lower bound of the demand envelopes, which I think we're all pretty familiar with now. So that from a demand standpoint, that sort of sets our range. And then from a supply standpoint, we took the baseline and then the risk adjusted supplies. And then we applied the city's current supply priority methodology, and then we applied an adjusted methodology to try to show where there might be opportunities to get more from the existing portfolio. We continued to use the historical hydrology for the scenario simulation. And then for the design drought, we took the historical hydrology from 2013 to 2019, and then we extended it 2020 to 2022 to get that extended drought condition, so that we used the yields from 2015 to 2017 to extend that historic drought out to 2022. And that's what we are calling our design drought for this analysis. And that is something that we can talk about and modify as we move into future portfolio analysis. But it was a way for us to kind of bracket this next simulation. So if you go to the next slide. And there's a build here, so you maybe advance 4 slides. Okay, so these are pie graphs representing the allocation of each supply to meet a projected demand under that scenario. So the baseline supplies are across the top, the risk-adjusted supplies are across the bottom. The lower bound demand is on the left, and the upper bound demand is on the right. So really the more severe, what that does is it creates the more severe conditions in the lower right and the less severe conditions in the upper left. And then you can see that we use the same colors for all the various supplies. We added a couple here. One is supplemental water purchase, and that's that kind of horizontal hatch. And then we added a what's called here mandatory conservation. You can see we're kind of going back and forth on nomenclature, but that's the same as extraordinary conservation. So that's kind of how these graphs work. So what it shows is that as you move from the baseline supplies to the risk-adjusted supplies, there is an increase in the need to purchase supplemental water. And then in the worst case scenario of the upper bound of demand with the risk-adjusted supplies, there's a very significant extraordinary conservation of about 21%. The other key take home from these graphs is the importance of groundwater and desal during this design drought condition. So, I mean, if you look in the upper left, even with the lower bound demands and the baseline supplies, groundwater and desal make up over 50% of the city's total water supply in that extended drought condition. So very significant. Let's see if I had anything else in my notes for this slide. That pretty much covers it, but you can see how as the demand increases and as the risk impacts affect your existing supplies, that really drives that extraordinary conservation and additional water purchase that's shown in the lower right there. Commissioner Keller?
Yeah, thank you. I understand it. My only comment is let's stick with extraordinary conservation as opposed to mandatory, just because of the clarification that you made earlier. So I think that's probably better. Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions, or shall we move on? Okay, so let's move forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll make that change, and I apologize there. We had intended to make it before the slides were finalized. So looking at adjusting the desalination priority, this is pretty interesting. We're not looking for any kind of policy decisions right now in terms of prioritization of desal. This was really just to kind of introduce a concept and show you how the analytical tool sets that we're building can help identify and understand opportunities to get more out of the city's existing portfolio. And that's kind of leading to that question about what can the city be doing to get more value from its existing investments. So what this graph shows is on the left there, we've got the existing demand and the current supply prioritization. And you can see that during the drought years, we have supplemental water purchase. And in 1 year of this design drought, we have some extraordinary conservation. So in 2016 is what's shown here. And then you can see kind of how that prioritization plays out. You see diminishing Kachuma supplies, and then bringing desal on as a drought supply, and then keeping desal available during drought recovery, and then purchasing supplemental water to make up what can't be fulfilled with extraordinary conservation. So this is kind of the current conditions, if you will, with the current supply prioritization. The graphic on the right shows a different prioritization. So it basically says, well, what if the city were to prioritize desal ahead of the drought? What would that do? And what it does is it creates this additional opportunity, which is the carryover storage in Cachuma. So it essentially allows you to store more water in Cachuma, which mitigates or attenuates the drought impact as you move into those dry conditions. So significantly reduces the amount of supplemental water purchase as well as the extraordinary conservation. So it's a way to basically take advantage of your reservoir capacity in Cachuma to store water by producing water from desal instead of drawing water from Cachuma during non-drought years. So Joshua, did you have a comment to make?
I was just going to add that I think as we start to work through these different strategies, another side effect of prioritizing desal, like in this situation, is the real value is that then it starts to allow you to leverage, as Jeff was saying, your surface water, but it also kind of heads off those potentials of having to expand desal beyond what it currently is. I mean, it certainly reduces the risks of having to do that. And we can get to maybe in our next analysis in October with you, it's one of those scenarios where if you had desal operating from the beginning of this drought, so 2011, operating every year, you're able to, would have carried more over in Cachuma and would have reduced the need to, for example, if we would have waited till 2015, 2016 to start up desal, and now we need to bring it on at a much larger capacity because we waited too long to reactivate it. So I think these are all, and we're just throwing out different scenarios. These are all things we're going to be working on and bringing back to you as part of some of the portfolio options. But it just kind of shows how you're taking the assets that you have and you're able to leverage them so that you're able to get potentially more out of maybe your existing water rights or storage reservoirs or groundwater basins. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Just a comment on this one. It took me a little while to understand the graphic on the right, the desalination prioritized, just because some of the terminology is new, like, the carryover, you haven't really talked about it. So it might be good to have, if you're presenting this, have an introductory slide that explains how we're going to do that carryover that we hadn't considered it before. And then the other thing is the legend is very small, so it's hard to read. So it took me a while to sort of understand the legend. And then once I got the legend, I understood what you were trying to do. But yeah, thank you. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, just a couple comments. Yeah, I'd like to see how this evolves into the next phase, obviously. What I don't understand, and we'll be looking for more information later, is Cachuma is not necessarily in our control. Desal is. And again, going forward, if we're counting on essentially carryover in Cachuma for our drought buffer, and we're not in control of that drought buffer, how does that play in terms of the actual administration and operations? And I, again, concur with Arturo's comments. The graph basically was hard to understand at first in the size and et cetera, in that regard. And again, when I look back, we've always essentially tried to prioritize those in our control to basically deal with droughts. Those outside of our control, again, we got to deal with that as it comes. But you stimulated at least some thought. Joshua's comments there have stimulated some thought. I look forward to seeing how that evolves in the next.
Councilwoman Sneddon?
Thank you. I want to echo those comments, and then just maybe the additional, the color bars, the order that they're in with the recycled water at the bottom and then desal, and that those bars are constant, as if indicating that we have control over them, is how it appears to me. But it'd be nice if on the other graphs earlier, when we were talking about moving desal not as the top part of that variable bar, that it mirrors this order of colors also, so that you could look at it side by side and see how does that particular supply change over time as a sort of even eye movement back and forth, if that makes sense, to have the colors be in the same order, whether it's by prioritization or however that that's decided on.
Yeah, that's good feedback, and I appreciate that. I think we were trying to depict a different order of priority between these two graphs. That was the intention, to show what if desal was prioritized ahead of Kachuma, as an example. And that's really what happens. That's why the light blue moves to the bottom, moving from the left graph to the right, because now we're prioritizing desal over Kachuma, and that allows us to create this carryover supply. But I think, and then as it relates to the historical simulation, as I mentioned, those weren't intended to reflect priority, but I think the consistency you're pointing out is important. So we'll look back at these graphs and make sure that, to the extent that we can, for the purposes of the analysis, we're being consistent in terms of the order of the colors.
Commissioner Davis?
I don't know if I totally agree, only from the standpoint of, if we're going to be prioritizing, to see how it's been prioritized is different than the future, what we might do. So the consistency from the past to the future, I'm not so concerned about. What I am concerned about, and again, that's why I say I want to wait till see where we go in the next phase, is it's one thing simply to look at bar graphs and talk about supply. It's another one when you start to roll in cost, in environmental effects, and et cetera, to how it all blends to basically get to how do you then prioritize those things. Yeah, and one of my questions coming in a staff report, it talked about desal provides supply flexibility benefits when prioritizes annual baseline supply. Well, I get it a little bit more now that you've explained it here, but again, I'm going to look forward to the next phase, because you've got to roll in everything else. Cost and environmental have to basically overlay to get to how you really set those priorities. So again, those are my comments for now. Thanks.
I love it. I mean, you guys are really just highlighting kind of where we are in the journey and where we're headed. So it's great. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can go forward.
Okay, so this is another little bit of the existing portfolio analysis, and this is to address an earlier comment regarding Gibraltar. And we thought that it would be helpful to show this graph in a cumulative form. So what you see, that blue line is the cumulative supply from Gibraltar with the existing baseline projection over the historical period. So that's what the blue line represents. And what the orange line says is, well, what happens if we get increased sedimentation and we can't get a contract, a WARN Act contract for our pass-through? How much water will we be able to realize from Gibraltar over time? And then the gray line on top is, what if we have that high sedimentation, but we're able to get a WARN Act contract so we can pass through that supply to Kachuma? How much water is available? So what you see is, even with increasing sedimentation, the value of the WARN Act contract is significant, and that's really the emphasis here, is that's an important element to allow the city to really get the most from its Gibraltar asset. And you can see that play out over time on a cumulative basis. So next slide. So some of the summary of the conclusions, and really we're going to be taking these conclusions to help inform the next phase of our analysis when we're looking at a much more thorough, a much more detailed evaluation from a triple bottom line perspective. But the biggest challenge is to meet demands during extended drought. So that's the aha moment, right? Big surprise. Meeting demands during drought, that's the biggest challenge. And during those drought conditions, those extended drought conditions, desal and groundwater and state project water and supplemental purchases are essential to continue to meet existing demands. And then, as we showed in that operational summary, simulation summary graph, desalination can provide some flexibility if it's prioritized. So desal can help you get more from your Kachuma asset if it's prioritized as a source of supply, as opposed to just a drought supply. So what's one of the biggest opportunities? Maybe the utilization of surplus water supply assets during normal and wet periods. So how do we use those supplies to create value for your ratepayers, but also maximize preparations for future drought. So that's really the biggest opportunity. And then the Warren Act contract to manage sedimentation in Gibraltar, as I showed, is critical. The next slide. The largest supply planning variables that we will be adapting to is we've got this assumption around post-drought rebound in customer demand. So that really presents a range of demands that we'll need to be able to consider within that demand envelope looking forward into the future. And then what might incremental reduction in water supply reliability look like? And that's primarily related to Kachuma, but it also could apply to groundwater and state water for that matter. So incremental changes in that reliability, how might that affect the city's water decisions? And then potential drastic reductions in existing supplies. If there are unforeseen conditions in the Delta or additional constraints on Kachuma, those big changes are the city's water resources management strategies will have to be able to accommodate or anticipate and have a strategy for how to address those potential drastic reductions in existing supplies. Next slide. So that got us through the existing portfolio analysis. And if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. I really appreciate your patience and time. I know we're over time here, but I'm available for any questions that you have. And Rob is available as well.
Well, first, thank you. I mean, this has been a lot of progress and really good analysis that we've seen so far, and really wanted to thank you and your team for all the work. We've had already a number of comments, but do we have any more questions or comments from council members or from council member or the commissioners? Commissioner Secretary, do we have any comments or questions from the public?
Chair Keller, I do not see any public comment at this time.
Okay, well, I think that's pretty much it. But thank you very much. I think this was very informative. It's a really good progress, and we really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. And I should have clarified. I do have a couple more slides to present that just sort of shows where we're headed, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Great. We're trying to get feedback through the presentation, but I wanted to show you kind of what next steps might look like. Next slide, please. So revisiting this graphic, our next step is looking at portfolios. And this is where we look at economic, social, environmental considerations. We develop themes for our portfolios and put those portfolios together and put them to the test, score them. It's a quantitative process and really come up with what we believe to be the top portfolio recommendations. Next slide. So some of the considerations, and I think Commissioner Keller brought up or there was a comment made by one of the commissioners around local control, and I love it. It's sort of foreshadowing this next phase of work. So looking at themes of portfolios, maybe there's a theme where we just we look at baseline or minimizing cost. That could be sort of those two could be combined potentially. Or maybe there's a theme to we want maximum reliability or minimizing environmental impacts or maximizing local control or maximizing water use efficiency. So those themes may help inform how we put together some of these optional supplemental supplies to evaluate portfolios as a whole. And some of the new supplies that we're anticipating looking at, potential for non-potable and potable reuse, expansion of desalination, additional supplemental water purchase options using the infrastructure for delivery of state water, options to store water, the potential for an aquifer storage and recovery or an ASR program, local storm or rain capture, and then potential for additional conservation or water use efficiency. Those are the key supplies that we're envisioning including in the next phase of analysis. Next slide. So I wanted to show you real quick the questions that we asked the stakeholder group, and we'll be coming back to you with more detailed report outs from this evaluation, but these were the questions that we took forward to the stakeholder group in our last meeting with them. The first question is, if we have surplus water in wet years,
I think the questions Jeff, the questions are in the following slides. These are the
Oh,
kind of
right.
the problem statements.
High
Yeah,
level topics.
there you
Yep,
go.
thank you, Tiffany. So the high level topics are dealing with capitalizing surplus water. And the big question is, how can we better use the water that we already have to create value for the community? And some of the considerations as it relates to utilizing existing water is, what is the frequency and magnitude of surplus? And I think we talked a little bit about that today. There's definitely some consideration there. And then what about storage and transport capabilities and needs? So can we be looking at utilizing existing available programs for storing and conveying water? And then are there environmental uses for surplus water? So that was the big question there, is how can we better use the water we already have? And then the next topic, next slide, please, is that in drought, we don't have enough water to meet immediate needs. So what is the big question? Well, how can we optimize the role of conservation in our future water supply? So what is conservation as a way of life? What does that mean for Santa Barbara specifically? What does that look and feel like? And how does that affect the cost of water? Because 80% of the city's operating costs are fixed. So even with reductions in consumption, there may not be reductions in cost for the customer. And then drought resistant supplies have varying operational costs, infrastructure costs, environmental impacts, and that can drive this sort of cost equation and help support conservation programs. And then how can we conserve water while maintaining quality of life? So this was a good discussion. And I should clarify that each of these topics we broke into three, we broke into three groups, and each group took on one of these topics in an exercise format, and we'll be able to give you a more detailed report out at a future presentation. And then the final topic that we covered in those group breakout sections with a stakeholder group was that the community's water decisions could have an inequitable impact on vulnerable populations. And we've sort of listed here some of the vulnerable populations that we wanted to make sure that we consider. And the key considerations for this topic are really the cost of water and the access to the water use or cost information. I think Joshua and Dakota were describing kind of the current conditions within the city. Renters, for example, may not have access to their water bill. So how do we provide access to water use information and water cost information? Water quality and how might water quality impacts vary across the city depending upon various water decisions, and then resilience to natural disasters. So the big question is, how can we better serve our vulnerable populations with the water decisions? So that's, I believe that is it. Any feedback on the stakeholder workshop 3 content that I just went through, the kind of the key topic areas of discussion, or any questions around next steps in the analysis and what you want to see from our team the next time we're in front of you? And with that concludes my presentation.
One of the things I wanted to throw out that is the commission has heard a little bit about is the Groundwater Sustainability Act. It's really a big game changer in the water supply world, and I think is likely to have significant impacts on the city during the next drought. And I say that because during this drought, we were able to go out and purchase water from agencies that had excess water. And what the GSA is going to do is it's going to actually make a marketplace for that water more consistently. And some of the concerns we're looking at is whether or not we will actually be able to find and buy water during the next drought. And so, but the other side to that is these groundwater agencies now are looking to, try and balance their portfolio. And so maybe during those wet years, we're able to bank in an unbalanced exchange some of our state water there, with an understanding that that water could be returned. So lots of dynamic situations happening. The GSAs are still unfolding. And I think it's going to be years before we see exactly how that marketplace shakes out. But I just bring that up because it came up I led the group talking about what to do with our surplus water. and it was a really interesting conversation. And I think it's an evolving area that we're looking to understand more the risks and benefits that we can extract from out of this process. So.
Okay. Well, thanks again. And I think thank you again for the team for that presentation. Yes, Councilmember Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Keller. I just want to re-emphasize my appreciation for the important work with the stakeholder groups and then the findings that have come out from that. And I think it really is clear in the posing of these major questions and how to prioritize. And I'm really gratified at how much public engagement has occurred in this. And again, knowing that it's very difficult, especially in time of COVID. And really these last few slides too, highlighting what the big questions are. And I'm looking forward to the next phase, but I feel very satisfied that these big questions are being addressed thoroughly, and just want to express my appreciation for that.
Thank you for that.
We really appreciate that. And I think we are continuing. I mean, we have a good discussion going on about, we're asking a lot of our stakeholder group. Some are asking for more information. They'd like to dig into this some more, and we're trying to be sensitive to the time they have available. Some, have more time available to them. And so we've been looking at potentially having almost like brown bag discussions where maybe Dakota and I will just present on a facet of water supply planning and then really open it up for more Q&A. So we're really trying to explore for those of our stakeholders who are really like wanting to better understand it, because it is, as this commission knows, this whole industry of water supply and is quite complicated. And we certainly aren't interested in, losing our community engagement on this. And so how do we maintain that transparency and engagement is complicated. So we continue to learn and evolve, I guess, as we get more input from our stakeholders. Dakota, if you had some comments on that.
No, I think that you summarized that really well, Joshua. I appreciate that. And I am really enjoying the engagement process and looking forward to how we can even better communicate with our customers and our stakeholders moving forward. I just wanted, before we close the presentation, I don't know if we can go back to the slide on the potential future portfolio themes. I think it's maybe 4 or 5 slides back. I just wanted to make sure that we got feedback from the water commissioners today to make sure that there isn't anything that's really missing from that list that you would like us to explore. That's good right there. Since this will be the next phase of our analysis, and we'll be coming back to you again once some of this work is done. So if everybody can just take a quick look and make sure that there's nothing major missing as we move forward in this part of the analysis.
I think it looks fine. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on. The only issue is I have to go to another call in 4 minutes. So we have the Water Resources Management Report. I don't know if we have, a quick report, or shall we take it up next time? I do need to get to another call.
Yes, and I do appreciate all of your time, and apologize that we have gone over, but the input was important today. I just want to show, so we have this, we'll send out this packet to the full commission, so you all have this as we intend with this. It's supposed to be information that you have available so that you can be responsive to customer concerns or constituent concerns if they come to you. It's basically just a peek into what's going on behind the scenes. I want to talk about, can you advance to the next slide, please? I wanted to talk about this new slide we've added, which takes this table and puts it into a graphical format. We got some feedback, I think, from the commission after the last meeting. Next slide. So here was an attempt to take that and move it into what we have as total production versus for the year versus actual production. That's the top one. And the bottom is planned production to date versus actual production to date. And so you can see in a graphical format what's on the how things are stacking up compared to what we thought. So I think that's really the big change. What we'll do is I didn't really have anything else I wanted to highlight right now. We'll put this together and it'll be available on our website to obviously any of our customers, but we'll also send the commission a link. They can review that. Of course, if you have any questions, be happy to take those up. But go back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hagmark. We have a minute. Any final questions or comments at this point? If you can be brief. Okay, thank you very much. Then I think we'll close it up for today. It was a very good meeting. Thank you for everybody for attending. And we'll have our next meeting in August, which will be the planning meeting. So thank you and stay safe.